The Roman-Etruscan Wars were a series of wars fought between ancient Rome and the Etruscans. From the earliest stages of the history of Rome, information about many of the wars is limited, particularly those in the early parts of Rome's history, and in large part is known from ancient texts alone. Prior to the foundation of Rome, according to the Roman foundation myth as relayed by Livy, the Etruscans, led by King Mezentius allied with King Turnus of the Rutuli, attacked the Latins and the exiled Trojans, led by Latinus and Aeneas respectively. The Latins and Trojans were victorious, and Turnus was killed in battle. Peace was afterwards concluded on the basis that the river Tiber would be the common boundary between the Etruscans and the Latins. War with Fidenae and Vari under Romulus. In the 8th century BC, during the reign of Rome's first king, Romulus, the Fidenates decided to suppress Rome as a future threat and began to waste its territory, in opposition to which Romulus marched on Fidenae and camped a mile from it. Setting an ambush in the thickets, he brought the rest of the army to the gates of Fidenae to provoke them into exiting the city. Seeing the appearance of disorder, the Fidenates sallied out in pursuit and were caught in the ambush. Romulus' troops drove the Fidenates through their gates so closely that they were not able to close them, and took the town. The Ventus were concerned at the situation with Fidenae both because of its proximity to Vari and their consanguinity with the Fidenates, and accordingly launched an incursion into Roman territory. After having done so, the Ventus returned to Vari with the booty. Romulus and the Roman army followed and met the Ventus in battle outside the walls of Vari. The Romans were victorious and the Ventus fled into the city. The Romans, not having the strength to take the city by storm, instead laid waste the lands. The Ventus sued for peace, and a 100-year treaty was concluded upon Ventus giving to the Romans a part of their own territory. In the Second War with Fidenae and Vari in the 7th century, Livy describes Fidenae as a Roman colony. It may be that a colony was established there after the defeat by Romulus. Second War with Fidenae and Vari under Tullus Hostilius. In the 7th century BC, during the reign of Rome's third king, Tullus Hostilius, the Fidenates and Ventus again went to war with Rome. According to Livy, they were incited to war by Metius Fuficius, the dictator of Alba Longa, who had been defeated by and had become in substance a vassal of Rome. The Fidenates openly revolted against Rome. Tullus summoned Metius and his army from Alba Longa and, together with the Roman army, marched on Fidenae. The Roman and Alban army crossed the Annar and camped near the confluction of the Annar and the Tiber. The army of Vari crossed the Tiber also and, with the Fidenates, formed up battle lines next to the river. The Ventus closest to the river and the Fidenates nearest the mountains. The Roman Alban army formed up facing them, the Romans towards the Ventus and the Albans towards the Fidenates. The battle commenced, however. Metius and the Alban troops headed slowly towards the mountains, intending to desert. Tullus exhorted his troops, telling them the Alban army had moved pursuant to his orders. The Fidenates, who being Roman colonists understood Latin, heard what Tullus said about the Albans and feared the Alban army would charge down upon them from the rear. Accordingly they fled the battle. The Romans then routed the Ventus. War with Vari and the Etruscans under Servius Tullius. In the 6th century BC, according to Livy, Rome's 6th king Servius Tullius went to war with Vari and with the Etruscans. Little is said of the war, except that the king was conspicuous for his valor and good fortune, that he routed a great army of the Etruscans and Ventus, and that the war helped cement his position at Rome, he having only recently become king. According According to the Fasta Triumphales, Servius celebrated 3 triumphs over the Etruscans, including on the 25th of November 571 BC and the 25th of May 567 BC. Livy records that during the reign of Servius' successor, Tarquinius Superbus, Rome renewed a treaty with the Etruscans. It is not clear which earlier peace treaty was renewed. War with Varian Tarquinia after the overthrow of the monarchy in 509 BC. In 509 BC the Roman monarchy was overthrown, and the Republic commenced with the election of the first consuls. The deposed king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, whose family originated from Tarquinia in Etruria, garnered the support of the cities of Varian Tarquinia, recalling to the former the regular losses of war and of land to the Roman state, and to the latter his family ties. The armies of the two cities followed Tarquin to battle but were defeated by the Roman army at the Battle of Silveracia. The consul Valerius collected the spoils of the routed Etruscans, and returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph on the 1st of March 509 BC. Livy writes that later in 509 BC Valerius returned to fight the Ventus. It is unclear whether this was continuing from the Battle of Silveracia, or was some fresh dispute. It is also unclear what happened in this dispute. War with Clusium in 508 BC. Tarquinius, having failed to regain the throne using his allies of Tarquinia and Vari, next sought the aid of Lars Porsena, king of Clusium in 508 BC. Clusium was at the time a powerful Etruscan city. The Roman Senate heard of the approach of Porsena's army, and were afraid lest the people of Rome should out of fear let the enemy into the city. Accordingly, the Senate took a number of measures to strengthen the resolve of the populace, including purchasing grain from the Volscia and from Cumae, nationalizing licenses for the sale of salt, exempting the lower classes from taxes and port customs duties. The measures were successful, and the mood of the populace turned against the enemy. Porsena, with his army, attacked Rome. As his troops were surging towards the Pons Sublicius, one of the bridges over the Tiber leading into the city, Publius Horatius Cocles leapt across the bridge to hold off the enemy, giving the Romans time to destroy the bridge. He was joined by Titus Herminius Aquilinus and Spurius Lartius. Herminius and Lartius retreated as the bridge was almost destroyed. Horatius waited until the bridge had fallen, then swam back across the river under enemy fire. A statue was erected to Horatius in the Comitium, along with land at the public expense, and also private rewards. As the attack had been unsuccessful, Porsena next determined to blockade the city. He established a garrison on the Janiculum, blocked river transport, and sent raiding parties into the surrounding countryside. During the siege, the consul Valerius baited a group of the Clusian army with a herd of cattle driven out through the Esquiline Gate. Titus Herminia was ordered to lay in wait along the Via Gabina, 2 miles from Rome. Spurius Lartius was posted with troops inside the Colline Gate. Consul Titus Lucretius Tricipatinus waited with troops at the Nevian Gate, whilst Valerius himself led troops down from the Coelian Hill. The trap was successful, and a band of Clusians were killed. The siege continued. Next, with the approval of the Senate, a Roman youth named Gaius Mucius stealthily entered the Etruscan camp with the intent of assassinating Porsena. However, when Mucius came close to the king, he could not tell apart the king from his secretary, and killed the king's secretary in error. Mucius was captured by the Etruscans, and brought before Porsena. He openly declared his identity and what had been his intent. He threatened that he was but merely the first of 300 Roman youths who would attempt such a deed. To prove his valor, Mucius thrust his hand into one of the Etruscan campfires, thereby earning for himself and his descendants the cognomen and Scaevola. Mucius was also granted farming land on the right-hand back of the Tiber, which later became known as the Mucia Prata. Porsena, shocked at the youth's bravery, dismissed him from the Etruscan camp, free to return to Rome. Most historical sources say the siege ended with a peace treaty. At this point, according to Livy, Porsena sent ambassadors to Rome to offer peace. Terms were negotiated. Porsena requested the throne be restored to Tarquinius, but the Romans refused. However, the Romans did agree to return to the Ventus lands taken from them in previous wars, and Roman hostages were agreed to be given in exchange for the withdrawal from the Janiculum of the Etruscan garrison. The peace was agreed, and hostages taken by Porsena. One of the hostages, a young woman named Cloelia, fled the Etruscan camp, leading away a group of Roman virgins. Porsena demanded she be returned, and the Romans consented. Upon her return, however, Porsena, being impressed by her bravery, allowed her to choose half the remaining hostages to be freed. She selected from amongst the hostages the young Roman boys to be freed. The Romans honored Cloelia with the unusual honor of a statue at the top of the Via Sacra, showing Cloelia mounted on a horse, that is, as an equess. Livy recounts that during his own time, public auctions of goods at Rome were by tradition referred to as selling the goods of King Porsena, and that this somehow relates to the war with Clusium. Livy concludes most likely it is because, when Porsena departed Rome, he left behind as a gift for the Romans his stores of provisions. Livy also records that, after the war, a number of the Etruscan soldiers returned to Rome to seek shelter following the war between Clusium and Aricia, and that a number of the Etruscans remained to live in Rome, and were granted an area to live which thereby became known as the Vicus Tuscus. In 507 BC, Porsena once again sent ambassadors to the Roman Senate, requesting the restoration of Tarquinius to the throne. Legates were sent back to Porsena to advise him that the Romans would never re-admit Tarquinius, and that Porsena should, out of respect for the Romans, cease requesting Tarquinius' readmittance. Porsena agreed, telling Tarquinius to continue his exile elsewhere than Clusium. Porsena also restored to the Romans the hostages, and also the lands of Veii that had been taken from Rome by treaty. Although the ancient Romans believed the siege was a historical event that had taken place, many modern historians think the war was at least partly mythical. War between Rome and the Sabines in 505–504 BC. In 505–504 BC there was war between Republican Rome and the Sabines, although Livy makes no mention of the involvement of the Etruscans. The Fasta Triumphales record that the consul Publius Valerius Poplicola celebrated a triumph over both the Sabines and the Ventus in May 504 BC. The Fabian War with Veii in 483–476 BC. In the years 483–476 BC, the Ventus waged a war against Rome, assisted by auxiliaries from amongst the Etruscans. On the Roman side, the members of the gens Fabia featured prominently, and it became almost a personal struggle by that family against Veii. Rome was successful in the war. Livy suggests that in the first year of the war the Romans paid little attention to it, as their own strength was more than sufficient, and they were distracted by internal matters. However, the Varian army entered Roman territory in the following year, 482 BC, and ravaged the countryside. Livy also says that the Ventus threatened to besiege Rome itself in the following year, 481 BC, but that command of the Roman forces was given to the consul Sp. furious Medullinus, and nothing notable occurred in that year. Fighting at Sutrium, Nepeta near Tarquinia 389–386 BC. Ancient narratives. In 390 BC, a Gaulish warband first defeated the Roman army at the Battle of the Allia and then sacked Rome. The ancient writers report that in 389 the Etruscans, the Volscia and the Equi all raised armies in hope of exploiting this blow to Roman power. According to Livy, the leading men of all of Etruria gathered at the sanctuary of Voltumna to form a hostile alliance against Rome. Beset by dangers on all sides, the Romans appointed Marcus Furius Camillus dictator. Camillus chose to march against the Volscia first, leaving, according to Livy, a force commanded by consular tribunal Aemilius Mamercinus in the Varian territory to guard against the Etruscans. In the course of 2 campaigns, Camillus inflicted crushing victories against the Volscia and the Equi and was now ready to take on the Etruscans. Livy and Plutarch, and more summarily Diodorus Siculus, narrates the fighting between Romans and Etruscans in very similar terms. While Camillus was away campaigning against the Volscia, the Etruscans laid siege to Sutrium, a Roman ally. The Sutrians sent for Rome for aid, and Camillus, now victorious against the Volscia and Equi, marched to the relief. But before any help could arrive, they were forced into a conditional surrender, being allowed to leave without weapons and only 1 garment apiece. Meeting the exiled Sutrians that same day, Camillus ordered the baggage left behind and marched his now unencumbered army to Sutrium, where he found the enemy still dispersed and busy plundering the city. Camillus ordered all the gates closed and attacked before the Etruscans could concentrate the forces. The now trapped Etruscans at first intended to fight to the end, but when hearing that their lives would be spared, they surrendered in great number. Sutrium was thus captured twice in the same day. Livy provides a description of the amount of spoils taken. Having won 3 simultaneous wars, Camillus returned to Rome in triumph. The Etruscan prisoners were publicly sold, after the gold owed to Rome's matrons had been repaid. Enough was left for 3 golden bowls inscribed with the name of Camillus and placed in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus before the feet of the statue of Juno. Livy is our only written source for the subsequent years. He writes that in 388 a Roman army invaded the territory of Tarquinia, where the towns of Cortuossa and Contenebra were captured. The former was taken by surprise and fell at the first assault. At Contenebra a small garrison attempted to resist, but after a few days succumbed to superior Roman numbers. In 387 there were rumors in Rome that Etruria was in arms, and the Romans once again turned to Camillus, who was one of 6 elected consular tribune, for 386. However, Camillus was diverted by news that the Volscians had invaded the Pomptine territory. With Camillus occupied, the Etruscans attacked the border strongholds of Nepeta and Sutrium. However, Camillus soon defeated the Volscians, and meanwhile a second army was raised at Rome. Camillus and his colleague P. Valerius Potitus Poplicola received command of the Second Army in the war against the Etruscans. By the time Camillus and Valerius arrived at Sutrium, the Etruscans had taken half the city, the Sutrians desperately defending the rest behind street barricades. Camillus divided his army into 2 and ordered his colleague to attack the walls on the side the enemy was holding. Attacked from both within and without the city, the Etruscans fled in panic and were killed in great numbers. Having recaptured Sutrium, the Roman army marched to Nepeta, which by that time had surrendered to the Etruscans after treachery from some of the townsmen. Camillus first attempted to convince the Nepetans to throw out the Etruscans. When they refused, he captured the city by storm. All the Etruscans and those who had sided with them were killed and a Roman garrison put in place. After this victory, no further conflict is reported between Romans and Etruscans until 358, when Rome again clashed with Tarquinia. Modern interpretations. The sources frequently refer to meetings of the Etruscan League at the Temple of Voltumna. The league still existed during the Roman Empire when it met near Volsini. This might have been the meeting place during the 4th century as well. However, modern historians consider the Etruscan League to have been a purely religious organization dedicated to celebrate common Etruscan festivals. It was never a military alliance. Rather, the Roman annalistic records and other sources seem to describe it as united Etruria divided into several rival city-states. References to all of Etruria united against Rome are therefore considered unhistorical. The original Roman records perhaps stated there had been fighting against the Etruscans, without specifying the city. Later writers have then expanded this to involve all of Etruria, including plausible but fictitious meetings of the Etruscan League. The many similarities between accounts of the campaigns of 389 and 386 in both Camillus is placed in command, defeats the Volscia and comes to the aid of Sutrium, has caused several modern authors to consider these to be doublets of each other. This was the view taken by Belloc, who held that the Gallic sack had a severe and long-lasting effect on Rome's fortunes. Accordingly, Camillus' stunning victories against the Etruscans and Volscia soon after must be inventions designed to minimize the scale of the Roman defeat. Different later writers then treated these invented victories in different ways, assigning them to different years with different incidental detail, until in Livius' writings they emerge as separate, but ultimately both unhistorical, events. Cornell believes the Gallic sack of Rome to have been a setback from which she rapidly recovered, and sees the Roman victories that followed as continuation of an aggressive expansionist policy begun in the 420s. The accounts of these victories have been exaggerated and elaborated, and some events duplicated, but essentially describe historical events that fit into this broader picture of Roman expansion. While the role of Camillus has been exaggerated, the frequency in which he is recorded to have held office attests to his political importance in Rome during this era. Oakley considers the accounts of a Roman victory against Etruscans in 389 to be historical, although all the details beyond the bare fact that Sutrium was successfully relieved have likely been invented, except for the repayment of the gold to the matrons. Livius' description of Camillus' 389 triumph could be based on authentic information. If so, this would help confirm the fighting in 389. He also believes the campaign of 386 could be historical as well, although with some of the detail transplanted from 389. A major victory by Camillus in this year would explain why no further fighting is recorded on Rome's Etruscan frontier until 358. Forsyth takes the more skeptical view. He believes only the existence of 3 golden bowls dedicated by Camillus to Juno to be historical, for these ancient writers have invented a series of lighting victories against the traditional enemies of Rome at the time of Camillus, the Etruscans, the Equi and the Volscia, and dated them to the year after the Gallic sack, when Rome was supposed to be beset by enemies on all sides. Livius' report of the capture of Corfu Ossa and Cantenabre in 388 has received much less skepticism than the campaigns of 389 and 386. No further Records of Corfu, Ossa and Cantenabra have been preserved and the sites are today unknown, as there would have been little incentive for ancient writers to invent the capture of obscure villages. Modern historians tend to consider mention of otherwise unknown sites to be based on genuine records. Excavations at modern San Giovinale near Tarquinia have revealed a settlement founded about 650 and destroyed in the early 4th century.